Hello everyone. Isn't it strange to think that I've been with you for several months now and we still haven't actually got to meet each other? That's one of the things I've really missed during this lockdown season. The chance to meet you, to have a cup of coffee with you after church, to get to know you face to face. But of course I'm not alone in this. All of us have missed things in this strange time of lockdown. And I wonder, what is it that you've missed the most? Maybe you're a bit like the journalist Helen Kofi, who wrote a rather surprising piece for The Independent just a couple of weeks ago. Listen to this headline. Dazzlingly diverse and at times infuriating. Going to church is what I've missed most during lockdown. It's not the sort of piece you would expect to find in a mainstream newspaper these days, is it? But Helen Kofi perfectly articulates what so many of us in the church feel at the moment. Listen to how she begins her article. I've inadvertently found a new hobby during lockdown, she writes. I spend every Sunday night in front of my computer in tears. There's something about church that makes the loss of lockdown particularly felt for Kofi. She goes on. I don't sob when I see my friends over video call, she writes. I don't weep when I ring my mum. I don't even lose it when I Zoom with my little nieces. Yet for some reason, every Sunday night at church, the new live-streamed digital version I attend from my bedroom, I cannot contain my emotion. It just comes pouring straight out of my tear ducts like a burst pipe. I wonder, does that sound familiar to you? While we're thankful for the opportunity to worship together online, we have missed gathering together, haven't we? And we long to hear the words that begin our psalm for today. I rejoiced with those who said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. But we're not quite there yet. Yes, lockdown is beginning to ease, and yes, there are opportunities for us to gather in small groups. But gathering as church the way we are used to is still quite some way off. And so Psalm 122 might be a strange psalm for us to be thinking about today. Maybe it would be more appropriate for us to be in Psalm 137, for example. You remember that famous opening, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. But I want to suggest to you that Psalm 122 is exactly the psalm we need for this present moment. As Christoph reminded us just a couple of weeks ago when we began this series, the Christian life is not about sitting down. It's about walking in the way. And Psalm 122 reminds us just that. It reminds us that we are a people on the move. We're on a journey of ascent. And while this is of course true at all points in the Christian life, I think it's especially true in this season of lockdown. In a very real sense, we are on a pilgrimage. We're on a pilgrimage back to this place, to this building in Ballyhackamore, back to gathered church. Perhaps you're a little bit skeptical of this comparison of lockdown with pilgrimage. This has been a time of stasis after all, not of journeying. And maybe you are tempted to think of the last 3 or 4 months as a complete write-off, as wasted time that's been robbed from you. Your plans have been frustrated. You've not been able to do the things you wanted to do. Well, if that's how you feel, allow Psalm 122 to invite you to think of lockdown a little bit differently. To instead of seeing this as wasted time, see it as an opportunity for pilgrimage. Now, I have to admit, I've never been on a pilgrimage myself. As Christoph shared that beautiful vista of the Mourns with us last week, I was reminded that the only thing near to a pilgrimage that I've done is a failed attempt to do the Mourn Challenge. But recently, I was able to listen online to a conversation between some pilgrims who are reflecting on their own time of lockdown. And I discovered, listening to them, that there are actually some striking similarities between the experience of pilgrimage and the experience that we have all shared. An obvious comparison is routine. When you're a pilgrim, you do the same thing every day. You get up, you walk, you eat, you sleep, you repeat. Hasn't that been our experience of lockdown? Every day is pretty much the same. We get up, we do our homeschooling, our household chores, our work, whatever it might be. We eat, probably more than we should. We sleep, we repeat. Every day is like the one before. And while this might be a source of frustration to us, to the pilgrim, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to get into a rhythm where we can listen to the voice of God in our lives. One of the pilgrims commented, and this really struck me, that the one thing that has not been locked down these past months is the inner life. And I found it interesting listening to them that they continue to practice some of the principles in lockdown that they practice on pilgrimage. And in fact, these are some principles that we've all discovered in these strange months. Let me share them with you. On pilgrimage, they focus on community support, an awareness of surroundings, an emphasis on living in the present. Aren't these things that we've discovered during lockdown? We've relied on our neighbours, on friends to get things for us when we've not been able to go out, to check in on us, to make sure we're okay. We've been very aware of our immediate surroundings, of local parks, our back garden, whatever it might be. And of course, we've all had to get used to living in the present moment, not quite knowing what the next day will bring. So maybe you can see that lockdown is not so different from pilgrimage after all. Now, this isn't to romanticize the situation that we find ourselves in, or to say that it isn't difficult. We all know that it is. But it is to encourage you to embrace this season as an opportunity for growth. And I want to suggest that Psalm 122 helps us to do that. In fact, there are two lessons I think this psalm teaches us about how we might progress on a lockdown pilgrimage. And the first is this: we're to remember where we are going. Of all the Psalms of Ascent, it's this one that is most obviously to do with pilgrimage. It's a psalm about arrival. It's about getting to that final destination, the city of Jerusalem. And keeping that in mind, don't you think then it's a little bit strange that this psalm about ending is actually towards the beginning of the sequence of 15 songs? I wondered to myself this week why that might be. And the answer came when I put myself in the shoes of the pilgrims for a moment. I imagine being a couple of days into my journey. My feet are starting to get sore. My knees are starting to ache. The journey is beginning to take its toll, and I've lost that initial burst of enthusiasm. What would I need at this point in my journey when I'm starting to flag a little bit? A song that will motivate me, remind me of the goal to which I'm walking towards. And that's what Psalm 122 does. It's a song of motivation, of encouragement for the journey. And of course, the goal is Jerusalem. But it's more than that. It's what Jerusalem represents. And this can be summed up in a word that is repeated in lots of different ways throughout the psalm: shalom. Shalom is a word that's hard to translate in English, but it's often rendered as peace or well-being. And it's a word that's so important to the ancient Israelites that it's actually embedded, it's contained within the name of the holy city, Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem. As the theologian Walter Brueggemann explains, Jerusalem is the seat of shalom. It is God's gift to Israel, and it's a gift that will one day be extended to the whole world in Jesus Christ. And the psalm gives us some interesting ideas about what this shalom looks like for God's people. Let's have a look at it again and see. Firstly, Jerusalem is a place of safety, of protection. Last week, Christoph explained how the pilgrims looked to God for protection. And in this psalm, we see how Jerusalem, that city on a hill, surrounded by its high walls, was a tangible representation of God's protection over his people. Secondly, Jerusalem is a place of justice. There stand the thrones for judgment, the thrones of the house of David, we read. It was a place where the weak, the needy, and the vulnerable should be able to go to get justice. So what we have in this psalm is a reminder of where the pilgrimage is going, some much needed motivation for the weary pilgrim. Not a reminder of the place itself, but of what that place represents, the shalom of God. Well, we're 4 months into our pilgrimage now, and the journey is starting to take its toll. We are weary. We are fed up. We need some motivation. We need to listen to Psalm 122. We need to sing this song of ascent. Because our journey is not Jerusalem. It's not even this building in Ballyhackamore. It's the shalom of God, the peace of God, the justice of God, the love of God in our lives. That's our first lockdown lesson from Psalm 122. Let's turn now to our second one. We need a liturgy for the road. One of the things pilgrims will tell you is that to get the most out of pilgrimage, there needs to be some intentionality on behalf of the pilgrim. In other words, we don't just focus on where we're going, but on how we get there. And this is one of the things that Psalm 122 helps us with. It gives us a liturgy for the journey. Did you notice how the last section begins with an imperative to pray? Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, says the psalmist. One commentator describes this as a liturgical invitation to prayer. And what follows in the psalm are words that the pilgrim might use as she journeys towards Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, and security within your towers. Peace be within you. Notice how this word we've been reflecting on, shalom, peace, features so prominently here. It's repeated 3 times for emphasis. Now, there's much we could say about this call to prayer, but that would require another sermon. For example, we could take these words at face value as a call to continue to pray for the city of Jerusalem, which in our world is facing so much division and conflict. Or we could think here about the similarity with these words and the words of the prophet Jeremiah. Remember that famous call of his to pray for the peace, the shalom, the welfare of the city of Babylon, which he repeats 3 times for emphasis. Is this a call for us to pray for our own city? And while those things are important for us as pilgrims of the way, I want to draw our attention to another way of reading these verses, a way that calls to mind the words of Jesus. Do you remember what Jesus says to his disciples when he appears to them in that locked room after Good Friday? They're huddled together in their own sort of lockdown. And Jesus enters and says 3 times, peace be with you. You see, I think here the psalmist is calling us not only to pray for Jerusalem, for the cities of this world, but to pray for ourselves, the people of God. How do we pray for that inner peace? Only a couple of weeks ago at our staff meeting, we were reflecting on how difficult it has been to get rest in this season, to experience the shalom of God in our lives. Even though we have escaped from so much of the joyless urgency that dominates our age, it has still been difficult to be still, to listen for God's voice. That's why we need a liturgy for the road. We need this psalm to help us as we journey. And so, as we draw to a close, I thought it might be helpful to suggest a couple of helpful, practical strategies that you might put in place as you go through your lockdown pilgrimage. And the first one is this. It's pretty simple. Pick up this dog-eared songbook of the church. Take these Psalms of Ascent and make them your own. Last week, Christoph challenged all of us to think about learning Psalm 121 by heart. I wonder if you've taken him up on that challenge. Well, maybe I could encourage you again to think about it. Because sometimes we don't have the words ourselves to pray, especially when we feel tired and worn out and fed up. So why not lift up these words of the psalmist and make them your own? Say them every day. Read them to yourself, even if you don't learn it. You'll discover in the process that they end up reading you. So that's our first strategy. Pick up the book of Psalms. Secondly, take time to prayerfully reflect. And here I want to recommend to you a practice, a spiritual discipline called the Examen. And our church administrator, Lila, has put together a resource that might help you to do this. You'll find it in the City of Love section on Church Suite under Extra Documents. It's a practice that encourages you to reflect back on the last week or month and to ask God to make you aware of where He's been at work. This is especially helpful, I think, if you're one of those people, like so many of us, who have seen lockdown as wasted time, as a blip in our lives. Well, allow this practice to invite you to see it differently. To recognize that you have in fact been on a pilgrimage, and perhaps that you've journeyed much further in and much further up than maybe you'd realized. So, Kirkpatrick, there we are, your lessons for lockdown. Now you're all set to continue on your lockdown pilgrimage. So don't be weary or downcast. Look up. Keep moving. Remember where you are going, and remember that you have a liturgy for the road. It won't be long before someday, hopefully very soon, we can rejoice with those words of the psalmist as we say to one another, let us go back to the house of the Lord. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.